Welcome back to Speed Demon Painting, where we are continuing our series on the Enlightened fleet, the support squadrons. Now, in this video we'll be going over the first part of the paint job, and as you can see I've took a bit of footage after I've done some airbrushing on the fleet. Now, when I'm using an airbrush, it's mostly because I want to get some very quick and easy transitions between very dark parts versus very light parts. The airbrush is the perfect tool for this because you can very quickly get a couple of quick highlights, which I'm indicating now, which directions I use to spray in to build up the cruisers, leaving some of that darker insignia blue in the recesses of the model. I've only used two colors for this: insignia blue from Vallejo Air range and grey blue from the Vallejo model range. And I'm just going over here with the cruisers. I'm using the second one here, how I've done the highlights, or how I choose to do my highlights. Essentially just pick out some of the ridges from the side so you can get some of that contrast from the top to the bottom. And when you look at it from the top, it'll actually look relatively uniformly blue. Now the real question is, if you don't have an airbrush, do you really need one for this one? Because you can achieve a very similar result using a dry brush. I'm getting my two paints out, which is that insignia blue that I mentioned and the grey blue, both from Vallejo. If you don't want to use an airbrush for this, I just use this type of brush. It's a makeup brush, which are known to have very soft bristles, and I try to find one that has a sharp bullet type point, so you can actually apply it quite controlled. Now the process of it is very simple. You just get both colors out on a dry palette. I don't recommend using a wet palette for this, a dry palette, because, well, you will be using a dry brush-esque type of technique doing this. You'll also need a bit of tissue paper just to get rid of the excess paint. And what I'm doing here is just grabbing that highest value color, the grey blue, and just wiping most of it off. And as you can see, the airbrush motion was mostly along the top ridge of this cruiser, so I'm just using a stippling motion across the top of that model, just to get some of the paint in the recesses as well, like an airbrush would have. And I'm just going down the whole model in this stippling like motion, especially in this part, although you can use more of a dry brush motion as well as you go along, which you'll see me doing in a bit here. You just want to have an indication of where your highest highlights are going to go. So essentially here I'm speeding things up, but just using more of a dry brush motion. Now after you've done your sort of sketch of your initial highlights, I start mixing in both of the values and wiping most of it off. And then rather than focusing on the middle, I focus on getting a transition between the two colors, because you do want that smoothness that an airbrush brings in one go. So I'm more focusing on, that transition between those two, get that mid-tone in there. Now as you'll see, the first pass of the dry brush was very minimal. You want to emphasize this a lot more because one pass doesn't really do a lot. So I'm just taking my highest value again and just building up those layers. Painting is all about building up layers, and using this stippling / dry brushing motion, you can actually do it fairly quickly. Not quite as fast as an airbrush could, but fairly good. So I've done about 4 or 5 passes at this stage, and I'm really getting there to get a very similar result. Now the right one might look a bit lighter at this stage, because that's mostly because the paint hasn't dried up. As it dries up, it will get slightly darker, and that will look more like the grey blue. So again, just stippling, not even bothering getting most of the paint off, because at this stage we're virtually working at the full opaqueness, the full coverage of this paint. And once it's done, you'll get an incredibly similar result, really getting the makeup brush in versus the airbrush. So you don't really need it, in my opinion. It does speed things up though, because I think I've spent about 10 minutes dry brushing, and I did the rest of the fleet in about the same time, so yeah, there you go. Now, whether I've airbrushed or I've dry brushed, I will be hitting it with pale grey blue as the highlight colour. I'm again using a makeup brush for this, and the trick to makeup, or rather dry brushing, is to get most of the paint off. And a quick way to verify that you've got most of it off is to just run it across the back of your hand a bit to make sure that you don't have any gaudy streaking that you can get when you're attempting to do dry brushing and there's still too much paint on it. It leaves nasty little streaks. Try to avoid it. Now, the dry brushing itself is really simple. You can do it very quickly with very swift motions. I just try to go against the panels so it catches mostly onto those and just work my way across the fleet. All in all, it's a process that doesn't take very long. While doing the cruisers, I again try to go against the panel line so you can create an edge highlight without too much effort. If you would be using a regular brush and edge highlighting all of this, it would take ages to do so, and that's not what this painting channel is all about. It's all about getting as effective a result in as little time as possible. And dry brushing is still one of those techniques you can really use. It can leave a bit of a chalky and dry result, but however, this is just the first stage to establish all of your values, and we'll still be using plenty of layers across it, plenty of glazes, so that chalkiness will die down slightly as you go along. And this is the end result of the dry brushing and the airbrushing combined. Now, I've lined up all of the frigates as well. I'm just going over to the cruisers, what it looks like. You can see there's, a few bits and bobs there where I did hit it with a dry brush where I don't necessarily want it, but again, it makes up for it once you add a few glazes over it. Now, I've lined up all of the frigates as well here, and have a guess which one is the one that actually was dry brushed and not airbrushed. Leave it in the comments if you will, if you actually got it right, because it's number 2 in this whole range, so it's hard to tell. Now, I also got a finished model for my fleet out to show you where we're going with all of this. Now, there's still quite a bit of washes and shading that will be added, along with some washes made with Vallejo rust pigments that we're aiming to do. But in order to achieve all of this, we still have 2 videos coming out, and if you're interested in them, well, give us a like and a follow.